Is China ready for the world? Is the world ready for China? Today, we have an amazing lineup of guests to answer that question with a spectrum of experience crossing fields from trade negotiations, media, film, news, management, and of course, cultural cross-communication. Li Zhao, who do we have today?
Our first guest is Mr. Douglas Gerber. He is the founder and CEO of Focus One.
Douglas, I remember in 1992, we were here in Beijing, and you closed a negotiation for Kodak with Xiamen Fuda, and that was the largest trade dispute in the history of China-U.S. relations, and you closed that. How did you do that?
I actually did that because I understood that people want to come together. And the key is that you have to bring different parties together. You can't just think about your own self-interest, and you can't think about the interest of the foreign company. So as we put things together, what we realized is that everybody find a common interest between parties. And if you can do that, you can close the deals. And that's what we did in 1992.
And it's your knowledge of entry into markets and cultural communication which is so essential. Because I remember Pepsi came and grabbed you. They recruited you from Kodak. They stole you away from Kodak to open their whole marketing campaign in China. I remember Wang Fei's picture was there with Pepsi and stars. And how did Pepsi actually overtook Coke in the market? You did that.
Yeah, in many markets, including Shanghai and Chengdu, in Guangzhou, in Sichuan, we overtook Coke, and we did that also by relating to young people in China. Blue is trendy. Red is older. So with the trendy part of blue, people said, I want to be part of Pepsi-Cola. And that's how we took over Coke.
So subliminal seduction of colors, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Now, you've moved on. You've set up your own consulting company. You are training CEOs and management in China and Chinese CEOs and management of international markets. Tell us about what you're doing now.
Okay, so I actually came to China in 1986 was my first trip to China. And in 1986, I found that everybody was thinking about themselves. And this IQ. It was all into an individual intelligence and IQ. Then we moved over to EQ, which is emotional intelligence, people becoming more sensitive to one another. Now I think that for China to be successful, it has to move into TQ, or Team Quotient. And that's essentially the title of the book that I wrote, Team Quotient, which essentially says if you want to be successful, and you want to be successful in China, you have to think about the collective. You have to move from IQ to EQ to TQ.
Team Quotient, your new book, is subtitled How to Build High-Performance Leadership Teams That Win Every Time.
That's right.
So is China's trade negotiation team going to have you come on board as an advisor to deal with Donald Trump? What do you think?
Well, what I would say is that you have to move away from individual leaders. You have to build a very successful leadership team if you want to be successful. You can't rely on an individual leadership now in today's world. You have to empower teams around the world. And that's the focus of what we try to do.
You have to have the willingness because you want to achieve something. And based on that mutual goal and the willingness, and I always talk this to my client also, you have to have this win-win situation. It's not about you or the other person. It's about we do this together so that we can achieve our goal together as a group.
That's what Douglas was talking about, group management, teamwork, right?
That's right. It only really works when you have people coming together and focusing on the team as opposed to focusing on the individual. So moving from a self-centered approach to a group or team collective approach, that's the success, and I think that's what's going to create success for China in the future.
And you know, that's what makes our program a success. We've just got a great team working with us here at CGTN.
Yeah.
And that brings us to our next guest, who is news and media. In China negotiations, there's a term that keeps coming up, mutual understanding. Douglas, how much of a challenge is this in building mutual understanding?
Well, I think mutual understanding, let's put it in the context of companies. So the example I would use here is Lenovo. You know, Lenovo is the largest maker of PCs in the world. You know, they bought IBM in 2006, and they're still bigger than Dell or HP or any of those manufacturers. So how have they done that? Essentially, it is a Chinese company that is truly global. and they have people from all around the world that work with them. They've had to actually work very closely and empower their leaders around the world. And so when, for example, if Chinese and Westerners get in a room, they sit in different places. What we need to do is get them to sit together and work together. If they go to dinner, they sit in different places. Get them together and work together. So Lenovo has been very effective in building trust through empowering leaders and getting people to realize that this is not just a Chinese company that has businesses overseas. This is a global company, and we respect American leaders, French leaders, Indian leaders as much as we do Chinese leaders.
Chinese people are very different from Western people. We're also very different from African people. So I think that to learn to deal with each other, the give and take, and the gradual process, I think, should be something that we bear in mind.
But I'd like to actually go beyond culture, so Chinese culture or Western culture. So when we work in a business environment and in a team, we say, okay, you might have 5 different nationalities. We're all trying to understand each other. Forget about trying to understand one another. Build your team culture. What's important for you as a team? And that's what we try to do, because if you have a strong team culture, that supersedes the national cultures. Then you'll be more effective.
Douglas, I think information is absolutely critical in making business decisions.
It is critical, and just going back to that point about media, I believe media inherently, every media has its own bias. It's supported by its own interest, and this is something that you can't get around. But what's interesting in this very open era that we have in this world today, people listening to the media make choices. Are you going to listen to Fox News or MSNBC? You make choices, and what we're actually seeing is that people will tend to use their own biases to listen to the media that they want to support their positions. So I actually don't fault the media. I think that people, if they really want to be objective, they need to have a certain sense of openness and look at different media and different sides. My question for you is, what media do you listen to? Because you can listen to a lot of the American media. Not all American media is anti-China. You can listen to Al Jazeera. You can listen to BBC. There are many types of media that actually will report on China in a very objective way.
Absolutely.
So again, this goes back to my point. It's the individual. We as individuals have to be intelligent the way we listen to media.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Increasingly, the audience is more and more intelligent in its...
Years ago, I wrote a book, Douglas, you may remember, called China Inc. And I kind of equated the leadership or even the standing committee, like the board of directors of a corporation, really managing the economy and managing the affairs in that sense. And we accept corporate structures all over the world. Our entire capital market is based on the corporate fiduciary duty of directors to their shareholders and the information that comes up. And so, in many ways, this management style or this group management, how does group management fit into, how can we say, changing the perspective from individual management?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I actually have this observation about success in today's world, and particularly with China, is that leaders are moving from a leader-centric management approach, which is basically focusing on the leaders and how great we are as leaders, to a leadership team-centric approach. In other words, empowering the leadership team. Now, why is this happening? First of all, it's technology, it's speed, and it's also globalization. So technology says things are moving faster. I was moderating a program for Marshall Goldsmith, who is a great leadership coach, last week. And what he was saying is that this is the slowest period of change you will ever experience in your life. In other words, it's only going to get faster. So with the speed of change, what we're finding is that technology makes it such that you as a leader, you have to decide very quickly. If it's all based on you, you won't be successful. You have to empower your leadership team. And the third is globalization. So globalization says that if you want to be successful and you want to be big, you have to be global as a company. Now, if I'm a Chinese leader, I have to then empower my leadership teams overseas. And so as a leader, it's less about me and my leadership skill, and it's more about how do I build my leadership teams. And that would be the message that I have for Chinese leaders, say, empower your global leadership teams to be successful.
In a sense, it is a bit of a leap of faith because it relies on us being able to let go of some decision making. But when it starts working, it takes on a bit of a life of its own. And I do believe that as we move forward, partly because of technology, but also because of the pressure of competition, that there are ways that companies don't need to have everybody in-house. They can create networks with customers and with other companies that are complementary, and they can build in flexibility and succeed in ways that weren't really considered viable in China a few years ago.
So one question I have for you, Campbell, is, with those networks and your outsourcing, do you consider them as part of your team? And how do you get that sense of team as opposed to, oh, this is a third-party supplier?
I think it is a slow process to begin with, and it's about building a degree of trust, and then of course it's about maintaining trust, because trust is slow to build but very fast to damage or to destroy. I do see them as an extension of our organisation and our goals. If you were to ask each of them whether they see themselves as a part of my organisation, you might get a different answer, but in the sense that we've got complementary goals, and we're trying to create a win-win situation. The reality I find amongst a lot of entrepreneurial businesses is that the value of a long-term relationship is far greater than the transactional business, just doing everything as a one-by-one deal. And so by investing in relationships and creating mutual trust, we can build a business that, whilst our own team is fairly modest in size, we can reach into cities and markets far beyond what we could do by ourselves.
So it's through the power of groups.
That's how I see it, yes.
Yeah. I'd like to pick up on this almost from...
I think that what's happening in the world today, we see this pressure for nationalism. You see it in the U.S., you see it with Brexit in Europe, you see it with Brazil. And so there is this trend moving in that direction. But I think that China can actually be different. If China can really be inclusive and go the other way and be global and continue on that path, China's going to be the winner.
And if China is so misunderstood outside by the Western media and politicians, let me ask a question to our guest today. How do you build that trust? Suzette, you're building all kinds of cross-cultural relations. How would you begin to build trust?
First of all, I think you have to, again, be open. Be aware of sometimes the information you collect might not be the full picture. And with that willingness, you then can go into depths of finding out what's really out there.
Yeah, I don't think it's the politicians who are going to do it. I really think it's business. There's so many commercial ties between China and the countries in the West. And what people find, and when I talk to people, whether they're in France or the US or Canada, they're saying, when I'm dealing with Chinese on a business level, and when I get to know them as people, it's wonderful. I love working with the Chinese. So I believe that it's those continued ties in business that will shift, brick by brick. It's not going to happen overnight. It happens brick by brick. The more people that get to know China on a commercial and transactional basis, the better it's going to be.
The real villain was some guy behind his back who hired Ben Kingsley to play the villain because he has dark skin, which is to say Hollywood had been practicing this racist habit of having dark-skinned people play villain. And it was because of the authoritarian government of China that changed this.
Yeah.
I think it's very significant.
I think what you're talking about is cultural stereotypes, and you're absolutely right. But what I would say is it works both ways. Because, I live in Hong Kong, and in Hong Kong we have a term called guailo.
Yes.
So guailo is a very racist
Totally
term,
agree.
right?
Totally agree.
If you've ever lived in Japan, so Japanese, when they look at foreigners, they're gaijin, right? So I think it works both ways. And again, I say, how do you bridge this divide? I think it only comes by getting people to together as individuals and as teams, as groups. And I don't think the politicians can solve it. I don't think the media will ever solve it. I really believe it's more people communicating and getting together, slowly changing opinion brick by brick.
Right,
Yeah.
I totally agree with that. I think a lot of direct communication rather than, seeing all those films or TV presentation. I actually did some research. I think there's actually some growth in tourism just by total number of trips. If you see this one, because 2018 hasn't quite finished yet, so we're only talking about the first half of both years, 2017 and 2018. There's a significant growth in tourism. Regarding domestic trips and also international trips. There's more Chinese tourism traveling abroad and also more revenues. There's a 2.8% revenues increasing year on year. And also we can see a lot of foreign tourists traveling here in China. We see there's 8% of people from coming from the American continent coming to China, and there's 12.1% European people coming to China. Oceania, there's 1.9%, and Africa, 1.3%. And of course, a large chunk is coming from Asian countries, which is pretty, easy to understand because a lot of Asian countries share similar cultures. So,
Absolutely.
right. So,
So what does that say about the need to travel, to get out and to see and to meet and to break down those stereotypes?
yeah.
I want to just go back to I think you made some great points about tourism because, I have many friends that, because of media, they had a negative impression of China, whether they're African or American or French or German. They come to China, when they travel here, their minds are totally blown. They're opened up. They say, oh, people are wonderful in China. They were so hospitable. They're so nice. And so this is the way to change perceptions and change minds, is get that cross-cultural elements going, traveling, and get people to realize that, hey, we don't have to listen to the media. We can actually experience this firsthand.
And I think it's the other way around as well. As more people going out of the country, traveling around the globe, be the ambassador, be the cultural ambassador yourself, present yourself, tell people, tell the outside world what is China really about.
So not just about international people from international countries coming to China, but also Chinese people really go out and see the whole world.
Yeah.
Especially, I want to mention this famous, let's say, luxury brands called Dolce & Gabbana. They recently did promotional ads on, portraying on Asian girls eating with chopsticks for those, pizza, right? Really using chopsticks for the Italian food, and it was really. Do you guys see that? Tech industries, Douglas?
Yeah, I would look at it from the leadership and the commercial perspective. And I'd say, as a leader, stop thinking about yourself and how great you are as a leader. Start thinking about how you're going to develop your people, your teams. How are you going to build trust? Because you have to empower decision making. You can't make all the decisions yourselves. Those leaders, whether they be in China, whether they be in the West, who actually do that and build their multicultural teams will be successful.